On July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 was still not finished, because footprints on the moon did not yet mean a surviving crew on Earth. The flag had already been planted. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had already climbed back from the lunar surface, and Michael Collins had already brought Columbia and Eagle back together in lunar orbit. But history had not yet become success. Source accounts and NASA records make the context clear. A moon landing that failed to return its crew would have been remembered very differently. The final question was practical and severe. Could 3 men, a small command module, and thousands of people on Earth bring the first lunar landing mission safely home? The return began with navigation rather than celebration. Columbia had to leave lunar orbit, cross the distance back to Earth, and arrive at exactly the right entry path. Spaceflight is often remembered through moments that look simple on television: a launch, a step, a splash. The work between those moments is less photogenic but more unforgiving. The spacecraft had consumables to conserve, systems to monitor, and a trajectory that could not be guessed. Mission Control kept checking numbers because the corridor into Earth atmosphere was narrow. Too shallow an arrival could skip the capsule outward. Too steep an arrival could make heat and force intolerable. That cause-and-effect chain is the reason July 24th belongs in the record as much as the lunar walk. Inside Columbia, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were returning from the most public achievement of the space age in a vehicle barely large enough for them. There was no room for a parade inside the command module. The crew lived with checklists, switches, food packets, waste systems, radio calls, and the fatigue of having done something no human beings had done before. Collins had spent the landing alone in lunar orbit, responsible for the spacecraft that would bring them home. Armstrong and Aldrin had walked on the moon and then still had to become disciplined spacecraft operators again. The mission demanded that all wait behind procedure, and the evidence of that discipline appears in the recovery photographs, voice transcripts, and engineering logs. Before re-entry, the service module had to be separated. It had carried propulsion, power, and support equipment across the mission, but the return through the atmosphere belonged to the command module and its heat shield. That small cone now carried the whole meaning of Apollo 11. The energy of lunar return was enormous. The capsule was not flying gently back into air. It was striking the atmosphere at tremendous speed and using drag, heat shield ablation, and carefully calculated angle to trade velocity for survival. For several minutes, ionized gas around the spacecraft interrupted radio communication. The world that had listened to the moon landing now had to wait through silence. When the parachute sequence appeared, the mission became visible again. Drogue chutes stabilized the capsule. Then the main parachutes opened above the Pacific. Those orange and white canopies were more than a recovery device. They were public proof that the spacecraft had survived the most dangerous part of the return. On July 24th, Columbia splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The lunar journey had become a round trip. The most famous exploration story of the 20th century ended first as an impact with water, a floating capsule, and recovery crews moving toward it. The recovery was a naval operation as much as a space operation. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet waited in the Pacific. Helicopters, swimmers, doctors, engineers, photographers, and command staff all had roles. Navy swimmers reached the capsule, secured flotation equipment, and helped the astronauts begin the next carefully scripted phase. Even after splashdown, Apollo 11 was not simply open the hatch and wave. NASA treated the possibility of lunar contamination seriously enough to build a quarantine procedure. The astronauts put on biological isolation garments, moved from ocean to helicopter, and then to the ship. That quarantine can look strange from a distance, but it reveals the mindset of the mission. Apollo was a public triumph built inside uncertainty. Scientists did not know everything about lunar material. Engineers and doctors had to consider risks that might seem remote but could not be dismissed just because the world wanted celebration. The mobile quarantine facility aboard Hornet turned the return into an image of controlled contradiction. 3 men home from the moon, visible through glass, alive and smiling, but still separated from the people applauding them. President Richard Nixon greeted the astronauts on Hornet, speaking to them while they remained inside the quarantine trailer. The scene was carefully staged, but it was also historically revealing. Apollo 11 belonged to engineering, science, military logistics, politics, television, and national memory all at once. The crew had gone farther than any travelers before them, yet their first homecoming conversation happened through a window. The glass made the moment more human rather than less. It showed that the return was not only a symbol, it was a managed physical process with unknowns still attached. The recovered spacecraft, the lunar samples, the photographs, the voice recordings, and the medical checks all became part of the evidence. Moon rocks went into custody and analysis. Columbia became a preserved artifact, scorched by re-entry and small enough to remind viewers how little separated the crew from the void. The mission's public memory often rushes toward the words spoken on the lunar surface, but July 24th adds the necessary final sentence. Exploration is not complete when people arrive somewhere new. It is complete when they can return with evidence, bodies, and story intact. That is why Apollo 11 splashdown still matters. The landing proved that humans could reach the moon. The return proved that the system could bring them back. It connected celestial ambition to ocean recovery, astronaut courage to Navy procedure, and national theater to quarantine protocol. On July 24, 1969, the most watched mission in history ended not on lunar dust but in Pacific water. The world could finally say that Apollo 11 had done the full impossible thing. It had carried human beings to another world and returned them alive to Earth.